Welcome back to the Relentless Minds podcast. I am your host, Laurie Jimenez. I created this platform with a sole mission, and that is to inspire people of all backgrounds to create the change they wish to see in their lives and in the world by sharing the examples of those who are. As a listener, you will hear the stories of ordinary men and women with extraordinary stories of overcoming adversities in order to experience the life they dream of. All of these individuals share a common interest. They desire a change for the better, and they are in a relentless pursuit to create that for themselves. If you're looking for inspiration to overcome challenges in your own life to create a life that you desire to have, then you have come to the right place. You see, the truth is, people everywhere are fighting for what they believe in, and together, with relentless action and mental strength, I have no doubt that we can fulfill that dream. Welcome back to the Relentless Minds podcast. This is your host, Laurie Jimenez. This is episode 2 of the 4-episode series covering the stories of genocide survivors in honor of April being Genocide Awareness Month, as well as this being the 26th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. In today's episode, I speak with Jacqueline, who is a lawyer, a human rights activist, and the founder of the nonprofit organization Genocide Survivors Foundation, which focuses on the prevention of genocide through educating the public, as well as supporting genocide survivors in various areas of need. Jacqueline is a survivor of the genocide against the tutsis in Rwanda in 1994. She was 9 years old when the genocide occurred. She had 6 siblings, the youngest being 2 months old, a father and mother, all of whom were killed during the genocide. Jacqueline managed to survive, and now in her adult life, she dedicates her life to educating people about how genocide occurs and how we as a society should understand the dangers of discrimination and intolerance as seen in history through genocide. She also highlights the importance of working to build a society that is accepting of all people, regardless of their culture, religion, or race. Let's start the conversation. Jacqueline, thank you so much for being here today. I truly appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. We're here in person in New York City so that we can talk about your story, surviving the genocide in Rwanda, and also now the life that you're living as a lawyer and human rights activist. And I want to talk about also your foundation, the Genocide Survivors Foundation, and the work that you're doing with that foundation to spread awareness of what is genocide, how it occurs, and how it affects people. And in addition to that, the work that you're doing to help those survivors. And so we're going to be learning a lot today. I'm very excited because it's a topic that, honestly speaking, before meeting you and your friends and Placide, I didn't know much about. I didn't know much about this topic, and I've learned a lot, but there's still some questions, and I want to make sure that my audience can really become informed. So thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I'm honored to be here.
So to start off, when it comes to your story as a survivor of the genocide, I want to understand how it was in that time that you were able to survive. Mm-hmm. How were you able to avoid being a victim, one of the hundreds of thousands of victims that lost their lives?
Whenever you speak to a survivor of the genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, most of them, if not all of them, will always tell you that we don't know how we survived. It's a miracle. It's a miracle that we survived, because the goal in 1994, the goal of the Hutu extremist government was extermination. Mm-hmm. Extermination of all Tutsis and any Hutu who was opposed to the genocidal plan. So that any of us survived is really, it's a miracle. Mm-hmm. Some people say it was luck. Some people say it was God. It depends on who you ask. But it was a miracle because when you have your own government against you and trying to exterminate you and your own people, when you have your own neighbors, people who you used to go to church with and to school with, attacking you and trying to kill you simply because who you are, it's nothing less than a miracle that you survive in such environment. But my own story of survival is a long one, as is the case with most survivors. But when the genocide started, I happened to be visiting my maternal grandmother. So from the very beginning of the genocide, I was not in the same space with my parents and my 6 siblings, because I was one of 7 children. I was visiting my maternal grandmother in a different village that was about 2 to 3 hours away. And one of the first things that the government did when the genocide began was to put roadblocks throughout Rwanda. This was done to prevent even those Tutsis who had the means to flee Rwanda from doing so. Because whenever you came across this roadblock and you're identified as a Tutsi, either by your ethnic ID card, because we all had ethnic-based ID cards that labeled all Rwandans as either a Hutu, a Tutsi, or Twa. This is an ID system, ethnic ID system that was introduced in Rwanda by the Belgians when the Belgians colonized Rwanda. And as we know, the goal of colonization was divide and conquer. So they divided the Rwandan population. They issued ethnic-based ID cards. So that by the time I was born in 1984, I was born in a country where you're not just considered a Rwandan, but you were either a Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. So during the genocide, when you came across a roadblock and you identified as a Tutsi, either by the ID or by your physical features, you were taken aside. If you were lucky, you were shot. By most cases, you died very terrible death. You were macheted, you were stabbed, you were buried alive. So at the very beginning of the genocide, it became impossible for me to ever go back to my parents' village. So we were separated. And when the killings began in my grandmother's village, my grandmother, myself, a cousin who was staying with us, and most of my mother's relatives in that village and other Tutsis in the village, we initially ran away to what would be an equivalent of a county office or mayor's office here in the U.S. And we ran away there because we thought we'd be protected. We told ourselves, that is the adults told themselves, certainly our local officials are going to protect us from our Hutu neighbors who are running after us with machetes. After all, people said, we've been good citizens, we paid our taxes, we've done everything that we were supposed to do. So we went there. People thought they would be protected. But also another reason I think that why a lot of Tutsis ran away there and tried to run away in the same place was that hopefully they could put up a resistance. If there were many of us in one spot, hopefully you were in a better position to fight for your life. So when we got to that county office, my grandmother, myself, my cousin, most relatives from my mother's side, we stayed there for a few days until our Hutu neighbors whose children had grown up playing with, neighbors whose children had grown up going to school with, going to church with, these Hutu neighbors started coming to the county office armed with machetes and clubs, spears, and they would come singing that all Tutsis deserve to die, all Tutsis are cockroaches. And this is a type of message or incitement to kill that they were hearing every day from the national radio. Every day during those 100 days of genocide, Hutu extremist government officials will come on the national radio and they will say, Tutsis are enemies, Tutsis are cockroaches, you have to urged Hutu civilians, you have to kill your Tutsi neighbors. They urged them not to have mercy on the elderly, on the children. So the goal was extermination. And while at that county office, I certainly witnessed a lot of death. A lot of my mother's side, relatives from my mother's side actually ended up being murdered there. So when I went to Rwanda a few years later, and I went to that county office, it is now a genocide memorial where it's estimated that more than 26,000 people were murdered there, including most of my mother's relatives. But for me and my grandmother and my cousin, we were very lucky in that we were not there when the final massacre and the final killings happened. And that was because one of my uncles, one of my mom's brothers, who had been a doctor in a different part of Rwanda before the genocide, he heard that we were at the county office. He heard that the killings were taking place every day, and he knew that it would be a matter of time before we were killed. And thankfully, he managed to find a Hutu man who he gave an ambulance from where he had worked previously before the genocide. And this Hutu man came one night, in the middle of the night, and he packed myself and my cousin and my grandmother in the back of an ambulance, and we fled. We left the county office in an effort to try to get to where my uncle was hiding at that time, which was a different part of Rwanda called Nyanza. And thankfully, my grandmother and I and my cousin, we arrived in Nyanza safely. We were hidden by a Hutu man for about a week or so until we were discovered. To this day, we're not sure how the Hutu neighbors who were out killing every day, how they found out that we were there. But I remember that one morning, My grandmother and I and my cousin, we heard very loud banging at the door, screaming at the Hutu man who was hiding us, saying, "We know you have cockroaches inside your house," because Tutsis were referred as cockroaches. "We know you have cockroach inside of your house, and we're going to find them, and we're going to kill them." And within what seemed like seconds or minutes, we had a group of Hutu men who were on top of us, screaming that they were going to kill us. And to this day, I always say that it's nothing less of a miracle that we survived that that attempt on our lives. But the Hutu man who was hiding us kept begging them, saying, "This is an old woman. My grandmother was in her 60s, and these are children. I was 9, and my cousin was 12. How can you say that these people are the enemy of the country?"
Yes.
But they kept saying, "It doesn't matter the age. It doesn't matter the sex. All Tutsis deserve to die." That was the goal. And to this day, I'm not sure how we survived. Whether they had mercy, whether they were, it was a miracle. But they decided to leave us alone. But they said that they told the Hutu men that if they came back and we were still there, they would kill us. Mm-hmm. So we knew that we had to leave. And it is at that time, long story short, because again, there's a lot of details that I'm not putting in talking about my story because it's a long story. But after that discovery or that attempt in our lives, the Hutu men told my grandmother there was an orphanage nearby, which was owned by 2 Italian priests. The orphanage had been had existed prior to the genocide. And when the genocide began, the Italian priests were among the few foreigners who stayed in Rwanda in an effort to try and protect Alie's children, whose parents were being killed and who were being hunted themselves. So these 2 Italian priests were taking in children, try to protect them, but they were not taking in adults, Tutsi adults, because they believed it was taking on greater risks if they allowed Tutsi adults to come to the orphanage. So as a result, my grandmother would not be allowed in that orphanage, but she knew that if anywhere, we had more chances, my cousin and I had more chances of surviving that orphanage because of the foreign presence of the 2 Italian priests than anywhere else in the country. Mm-hmm. So she begged the Hutu man who was hiding us to take us. And that ended up being the last time that I saw my grandmother, who had been really like my second mother because she raised me. I spent a lot of time growing up with her when I was young, and I always say she was my second mom. But that ended up being the last time that I saw her because once we went to the orphanage, my cousin and I, we lost all communication because, again, there were barricades all over, so we couldn't see her. And it is in that orphanage that my cousin and I survived, along with 300 plus other children. But even while in that orphanage, we experienced many attacks. There were many attacks at the orphanage where the priests will be told that they were going to separate all the children because there were also some Hutu children in the orphanage who had gone to the orphanage before the genocide, whose parents had died of natural causes, and they were there. So whenever the attacks happened, the Hutu civilians who were armed with machetes or the Hutu soldiers who had attacked the orphanage, they would say they were going to separate children along ethnic lines and they were going to kill all Tutsi children. And each time, those attacks happened, and there were many, we thought we were going to be killed. And the Italian priests would beg and they would bribe. So I remember that by the time the genocide ended, we no longer had food at the orphanage because the 2 Italian priests had used all the food supplies in the orphanage and all the money that they had to bribe these people in exchange for our lives. But it is in that environment that myself and my cousin and, again, 300 plus other children survived. And after the genocide, I will come to learn, as you know, that Waya had been one of the few who survived. Neither my parents, nor my 6 siblings, nor my grandmothers, most of my extended family members had survived. They had all been murdered in those 100 days. In respect to my own parents and my siblings, I learned specifically that one day during the genocide, my Hutu neighbors had come and had taken them to a nearby river where they had proceeded to murder them one by one and to throw their bodies in that same river. So after the genocide, I never had even the opportunity to find their bodies and to bury them, which is something that is very important to survivors. Those who are able to find the remains of their family members, they are able to properly bury them, and they're able to have like a tombstone where they can go and remember them. But for many survivors, even that was deprived. That was taken from us because many people who were murdered were thrown in rivers, like my own family, or they are thrown in mass graves where you will never know who your family members. So that contributes to the suffering and the trauma that many survivors still experience today.
Thank you so much for telling that entire story. That's a lot that you experienced in that time, along with so many people. And that's the truth of the matter, is that those that that were able to survive, still carry with them so much trauma and so much pain. I was reading Consola's memoir, and she was saying, like, even just trying to wrap your head around the atrocity, the inhumanity, neighbors that you knew growing up that were family friends that you felt loved you, were out to kill you. And it's something you can't understand. When it comes, and I'm actually very curious about this, when it comes to your own strength, you were 9 years old at this time. How were you able, because you were an orphan, and that's an additional challenge, because there isn't someone close that you can then confide in to tell your story and to, get that support, emotional, psychological support, that someone you trust. How did you cope? How were you able mentally to keep moving forward and not give up and say there's no reason to live anymore? No, it was very difficult, and I think it's an ongoing process, because there's really never a time when you forget that you're an orphan, and you're an orphan because your family was murdered simply because of who they are. And that's something that, I always emphasize. To me, genocide is really the greatest crime that human beings can commit against their fellow human beings, because to be murdered simply because of who you are, because of something that you did not have a choice in being. I didn't choose to be born a Tutsi or as opposed to a Hutu. Nobody chooses to be born in a Christian family or in a Jewish family. This is something that we have no choice in being. So to be murdered and hunted, and your family being taken away from you because of that, I find that there's really, in my opinion, no greater injustice. And this is something that I think is very important to, there are all kinds of human rights issues and all kinds of crimes being committed every day in our society, but I always say that's the worst. And I think that, during the genocide, one of the most difficult things that happened, as you said, was, the betrayal of the neighbors, because it would be one thing if, your family was killed by people who you didn't know and it was war and soldiers, but that trying to come to terms with, again, these people who you said you grew up with, playing with their children, attending the same weddings, the same child naming ceremonies, and these people are coming after you with machetes. So it took me a long time to understand it. But whenever I talk about genocide, it's always important for me to talk about how it happens, what causes it. And it's important for people to recognize that people do not get up one day and they want to pick up machetes and want to kill their neighbors. This is something that happens in a process. It begins with, discrimination, as was the case in Rwanda. There was state-sanctioned discrimination against Tutsis. It begins with indoctrination. So in the case of Rwanda, there was a lot of indoctrination by the Hutu-led government in anti-Tutsi propaganda, where Tutsis were always portrayed in Rwandan society as the enemies of the country, the invaders. They said Tutsis had invaded Rwanda long time ago from Ethiopia, and Tutsis were not true citizens like Hutus were. So there was this deprivation of rights from the very beginning, even prior to the genocide. As the years closer to the genocide came, specifically starting in 1990, there was also a huge dehumanization campaign against Tutsis in Rwanda's newspapers and radio, where Tutsis were portrayed not just as, the enemy, but they are now being dehumanized and portrayed as snakes, as cockroaches. And this process of dehumanization is something that you see across the board, whether you're talking about the Holocaust or the genocide in Bosnia, Cambodia. The genocide is a process. And I always tell people the best time to really intervene is not when the people have picked up machetes. It's when this dehumanization of any group of people is happening. It's when a group of people is being deprived of basic rights simply because of their religion or their race. This is really the time that we need to intervene in terms of prevention. So trying to understand what had happened to me, especially as a 9-year-old, was very difficult.
I remember that I was plagued with a lot of nightmares, as is the case with most survivors. I had a lot of nightmares where I wake up every morning crying because I'll see scenes of my family, see myself fleeing from people who are trying to kill me. And that continued even when I came to America. I was very lucky that I had an uncle who lived in the US, and after finding out that I had survived, he adopted me. So I came to live in this country when I was 10, a year after the genocide. And those first few years in this country, I struggled trying to come to terms with my survival. There were even a time when I used to wish that I would have died with my family, when I preferred death, because I felt like it was such a big burden at this age to be left wondering, like, why me? There's this thing called survivor guilt that most survivors have. It's like, why me? Yeah. I had 6
why
siblings.
Me? Why not them?
Why not them? I had 6 siblings. The youngest of my sibling was just 2 months old, about 2 months. During the genocide, I used to say, why not Daniel? He didn't even know his name, never mind his ethnicity. Why me? But I think at some point, at least for me, I came to realize that why I may not know specifically why it is that I survived, I realized that having survived, I have a responsibility to educate people about genocide, to educate people about the type of death that my family and over 1 million people died in 1994 in Rwanda, and also as a way to honor them and to memorialize them, but also as a way to hopefully do my part in preventing other children or other human beings to ever have to experience this. Because having gone through it, I understand that is the worst crime, as I said, and the consequences of that crime is something that all survivors live with, and it's unfortunately something that even our children and grandchildren will live with. Because I have a 3-year-old daughter now, and at one time she's going to ask me, what happened to your parents? How come I don't have maternal uncles or maternal aunts? And I'm going to have to tell her that story. So the consequences of a genocide is something that, as research suggests, even with the trauma, there's this thing called intergeneration transmission of trauma, that it not only ends with us, unfortunately, but it goes on. And this is why, I also do the work that I do now with survivors, is an effort to try to, minimize or at least address part of that trauma. It will never be completely eradicated, but there are certainly ways that survivors can be supported to better deal with us. And I think it's something that really the world owes to them, to provide that support.
Absolutely. And by providing that support and being able to provide resources to survivors, that's also a way, I would say, of honoring, that loss that they had to experience because of a failure. And I want to actually talk about that as well, about this failure to intervene at this time, and the implications that had, and also the effects in the international community that it caused. So just to backtrack a little bit, because when you were 10 years old, you came to this country. You were with your uncle, but you also met a very special gentleman who, I would say, because I found out you met him at 16, it seems like that could have been a pivotal moment in your life, because that's still an age where you're processing, you're still trying to learn and cope. And David Gertzman was his name, so he was a survivor of the Holocaust. I'm sure that was a very strong connection that you guys could have, over that experience, shared experience. Can you tell us about your relationship with David and when you met him, and the impact that had in you now, possibly finding your purpose in life due to that relationship?
Yeah. So I met David when I was 16, as you said. I was a sophomore in high school in Queens Village, New York. And I was at a point in my life where I had been living in this country for several years, but I was still struggling to come to terms with my experience. Because I also recognized that, with my classmates, my fellow 16-year-old classmates, they had no idea about what had happened in Rwanda. In fact, they didn't even know where Rwanda was. I had never shared my experiences. So they knew that I was an orphan from somewhere in Africa. That was about the nature of what they knew. And my classmates and I, we had the opportunity to read a book called Night by Elie, who was a Holocaust survivor and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And we read this book, Night. And after we read Night, my teacher, Miss Elisa Goldstein, had the wisdom to try and find a Holocaust survivor who could come to the classroom, because she understood that it's one thing to read about what happened in a book. It's another thing to actually have a survivor come. She understood the impact that having a survivor will have on us and my classmates and I. And David came and he described his experience during the Holocaust. He talked about being a child prior to the Holocaust with parents, with siblings, with relatives, with goals and dreams, and how that was taken away from him, in a process that was very similar to what happened in Rwanda. The deprivation of his rights and other Jews prior to the genocide, the dehumanization of Jews prior to the actual Holocaust happening. And I remember that while listening to him, in addition to being one of the classmates, was weeping as he described his story and his loss and his suffering. I saw some similarities between what had happened to him. Although he was talking about Holocaust that happened decades before the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, the similarities in the process of the Holocaust and genocide was striking. And after he shared his story, we wrote thank you notes to him, and in my thank you notes I happened to mention that I was a survivor from Rwanda. I shared my experience briefly. I never expected that I would hear from him, because he at that time he was getting hundreds of letters. He was going to schools all over New York City, all over this country, and speaking. So I never knew that, I would never expected a response. But a couple weeks later he wrote to me and he said he was very moved by my story and he wanted to meet. And long story short, a few weeks later we met at my uncle's house. And David is really the person who inspired me to share my story for the first time, starting with my own classmates, my own high school. He's the one who really, I felt at that point that I wanted to do something to honor my family and also to do my part in preventing future genocide. And I think David really came into my life at a time when I was looking for that opportunity, and he's the one who inspired me. I felt that if he could, be doing the education work that he was doing, as difficult as it was, I had to try too. So David and I, from 2001 when I met him until 2012 when he passed away, him and I traveled all this country, speaking at numerous high schools, middle schools, colleges, synagogues, churches, and our mission was the same: to tell the story, educate people about the crime of genocide, and tell them again what had happened to our families, but even more importantly, to educate particularly young kids and the future leaders of this country about the dangers of racism, about the dangers of anti-Semitism, about the dangers of xenophobia and all forms of extremism. Because we will tell these young people that although, God forbid, you ever find yourself in an environment that has a genocide, the genocide happens because racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia and all forms of extremism, genocide happen when those things are allowed to flourish and they are encouraged, and you have a government that benefits from that type of divisive politics. So that was our mission, and that was really what David and I did. And I remember that before he passed away in 2012, I promised him that. And it was a difficult time for me when he died, because I always felt like it was really the biggest loss that I suffered since losing my own family in the genocide, because he had become not only like a mentor, but he was a friend, and his family became my family. Even now we are still in touch. Obviously I actually saw his wife earlier this week, and I'm in touch with his daughter and his son and their children. So his family became my family, because again, both of us recognize that genocide is not something that knows boundaries or borders. It's something that can happen anywhere and to anyone, given the right condition. And that's why it's important that to this day, whether we are white or black or Jewish or Christian, this is something that we should be concerned about, because history shows that genocide has happened, in Europe, in South America, in Africa. It's something that can happen. So we all have the responsibility to try to create societies where diversity is not adversity, as David used to say, where the diversity, human diversity, is seen as an asset, not something that should be used by political leaders to manipulate and to divide and to carry out a mass murder of any group of people.
Absolutely. And a powerful quote that you say is that genocide, and you say this a lot, genocide does not happen overnight, right?
Yes.
And I know you've been mentioning this in earlier already in this interview about how, you know, we have to start intervening. We have to start taking action when people are being dehumanized.
Yes.
Right? And you gave the examples in the genocide of Rwanda before the genocide occurred, where Tutsis were being called cockroaches, and they were being depicted as the lesser species.
Yes.
You know, they were called snakes. They needed to be exterminated. And that also caused into attention, and that's another, you know, powerful thing to note about the media, how it played a strong role. I mean, even nowadays, it's just so powerful in influencing people. And so for me, I'm really curious because of all of these things that are playing a part. It's like so many things that are causing and encouraging this sort of behavior. What are some methods of intervention? Like, what are some things we need to focus on as a society and be against to combat this sort of behavior towards races, other races, you know, be prejudices that we may have against people, even on something that's on a smaller level. Like, what are things that we need to be aware of, we need to be accepting of to create a better society that's more accepting and to avoid this risk of genocide in the world?
Yeah. No, I think, you know, the first thing we need to understand, again, is to understand that genocide doesn't happen overnight. As you said, it's a process. And it happens when, you know, one group of people is portrayed as lesser than, whether that's because of their ethnicity, in the case of Rwanda, whether because it's their race or their religion. So I think what we need to do is whenever, and this usually happens initially, it begins from the political leaders. They are the ones who introduce this idea that certain people, because of their race, because of their religion, are lesser than, and they are the enemy. They make them the enemy of the state, the enemy of the people. So I think whenever we see a leader or anybody say to us that these people, because where they come from, they are criminals or they are not to be trusted. Like, even I can talk about even some of the things that have been happening in this country, US, right? We have a lot of xenophobia. We've had, you know, anti-Muslim movements where they said, okay, all Muslims are terrorists. Is that true? Of course not. Or all Mexicans are criminals. This is what's being said in the media.
These are examples.
These are examples. Or you talk about human beings as if they are some kind of animal. So you say the immigrants are coming to like infest our country. People don't infest. Cockroaches infest. You know, people don't infest. So whenever we hear this type of dehumanization, this type of portrayal of one group of people, an entire group of people, because I always say that it's important for us to realize, and I don't know if that was in my mind, that people don't see this. There's no group of human beings where everybody's a criminal, everybody's this. Criminals exist in all races, in all religions. So to depict, you know, an entire country or an entire group of people as lesser than, that's problematic. And I think as soon as we see that, whether it's in our media, whether it's in our leaders, whether it's in our school, whether it's in our churches, we need to speak up. Because that's how genocide happened. When people are allowed to be, we allow people to deprive rights, and then slowly we start seeing them as cockroaches that need to be exterminated. So I think the best way to fight genocide and to create societies where there is tolerance is really to identify these things, and to also the importance of recognizing that, because sometimes you hear somebody say something in a media and people will say, well, these are just words. So the other thing I always say when I speak is that for us to realize that words have power, particularly when they become from positions of authority. Words have power. Words have the power to heal or to bring a community together, and they have the power to divide a community. So particularly when they come from a president or other high officials, we need to pay attention. We need to make sure that we are supporting leaders, political leaders, communal leaders that understand that, again, diversity is an asset to any community, to any country, because at the end of the day, the more diversity we have, the more contributions that we have. And I think that's very important also to understand, because when you understand that, and when you understand that, again, there's no one group of human beings that's all bad, you really recognize that you can easily identify this type of divisive language. And when we hear it, we have to speak up, whether it's through protests, whether it's through writing letters, and certainly with our when we vote again, we need to vote for people. Especially, we live in New York City, and we're conducting this interview in New York City, and New York City is one of the most diverse.
Yes,
this is why I love living here.
It's very true.
I've been living here for all these years. This is a city where you see people from all over.
Yep.
And I always say there's no better place to teach appreciation for diversity than this. But even here, we are often hearing about hate crimes. Yeah. Hate crimes have been on a rise all over this country. People are being targeted because what they see in the media. They're being targeted because because of where they come from. And so whenever we talk about genocide, it's important for people to recognize that we're not just talking about something that happened far away in Africa. We're talking about something that is a danger to any society. Yeah. And we need to start early. And we need to teach our children about these dangers.
And the thing was that what we were talking about when it comes to genocide, it started with dehumanizing people. Yeah. These are lessons that we as an international community were learning from these events. Here in this society, it's happening, dehumanizing people and being racist and having these prejudices and outcasting groups of people. And that needs to be looked at. And, you brought a very important point about it's on an individual basis. Everybody has the responsibility to identify where these leaders or these people in authority are saying things that are not right, that are not going to lead us towards a more united and a more accepting and diverse society.
Yes.
And also you were mentioning, so speaking up, right? So speaking up, writing letters, doing protests,
voting for the right leaders.
And also since media is so powerful,
oh yes,
I'd say media platforms that are actually out there spreading truth and acceptance and a more loving approach to other individuals.
Yes.
And so I think that's very, very powerful. And you mentioned also about the role of early education.
Yeah.
Early education. I mean, can you speak to me, because I know you're speaking at schools.
Yes.
Right? And so what is the role that early education plays in teaching children, right? Teaching children that are our future leaders, right? About valuing human rights and respecting the dignity of other people.
Yeah. Education plays a critical role. I know David, the Holocaust survivor who inspired me, as I mentioned, he used to say that something that always struck with me and something that I often repeat. He used to say that in a world where we talk so much about weapons of mass destruction, we need to also talk even more about weapons of mass instruction. And he would talk about lectures in schools, he would talk about books, he would talk about exhibits. So him and I really understood and still understand the critical role that education plays in preventing genocide. I think that if we are to create societies where diversity is seen as an asset, is not adversity, as he used to say, we need to be teaching our children more than math and science and technology and all the subjects that they learn in school. We need to teach them about peaceful coexistence. We need to teach them about the dangers of racism, anti-Semitism, all type of extremism. We need to, and this need to start like early age. Obviously, it has to be appropriate for each age. I'm not saying that, I go to, elementary school kids or in daycares and talk about, genocide. I don't do that, actually. The youngest students I usually talk to about genocide is middle school students. But even before middle school, there are a lot of things that can be taught to kids early on to appreciate diversity. And even as parents, we have responsibility to make sure that our kids are exposed. Because exposure is also very important. A lot of these things happen because of ignorance. If somebody comes to you and says, Jews are like this, or Muslims like this, or Mexicans are like this, and you have never had a Mexican friend or a Jewish friend, you are more easily susceptible to believing those stereotypes. But if you have actually been exposed and you have a friend in these communities, you're going to say, no, I have a great friend, she's not this or he's not this. So as parents also, we have responsibility to make sure that our kids are exposed to diverse people and to recognize that, the humanity in all of us, that we have more in common then we have differences, and that our differences are something that should be seen as an asset. So for me, education is something that should really be across the board. This is why I'm always supporting genocide and Holocaust and really tolerance workshops and education being part of the curriculums. But you'd be surprised how many schools, like New York does very good, and New Jersey does very good. But there are some states, many states, where Holocaust and genocide education is not part of the curriculum, and I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think this is something again that should be taught in school across the board. And I think that's something that's really going to help us create future leaders who understand that diversity is an asset. It's something that should be embraced, and leaders who understand that when we hear people being dehumanized, or even worse, being murdered because of who they are, because of what they believe, that we have the responsibility as human beings to intervene and to go and protect them, because I think in this day it's the right thing to do. And I always say now it's becoming, not only is it a moral responsibility, because it's a practical. Because as Martin Luther King, one of his saying, he always said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I really believe it. If you don't prevent injustice when it's happening in Syria or in Rwanda, it makes it more likely that injustice is going to be at your own doorstep. So we have not only the moral responsibility, we have practical responsibility, especially now in a world that we're living now that's becoming very interconnected.
Absolutely.
We've been having this refugee crisis. I think for the first time Americans understood that, we can't just say these things are in Syria and so forth. Everything has implications for us, and I think it's again, for me, even the moral responsibility is enough, but we have practical reasons to intervene. Because the right thing to do, because a lot of these things happen because of the silence and the indifference of powerful countries. Because with the genocide in Rwanda, it wasn't because people didn't know. People knew. But people didn't, the Security Council, they received the messages every day from the head of the UN peacekeeping mission that genocide was about to begin. And Rwanda is a tiny country. People said they didn't even have to send troops. They could have cut the wires of the media that was advertising where Tutsis were hiding, or calling Tutsis cockroaches. So there was so many things that the UN Security Council, countries making up the UN Security Council, other countries could have done to prevent genocide or to intervene. But there was this indifference, because we still live in a world where people also feel that if something is happening in a country where we have no economic ties, for example, that it's not our business. And I think it's important that we really start recognizing that preventing genocide anyway is something that is in our interest as a society and as a human beings, and it's something that's going to get us to the kind of societies where we want to live in and where we want to leave our children with.
Yes. A very interesting thing I was learning about when it came to the genocide in Rwanda, that it was known as the preventable genocide because of the things that you were mentioning, that there were faxes being sent to the United States, to the UN, saying, hey, this is something that's starting to escalate.
Yes.
Right? There may be a genocide that's happening, and all of this hatred and propaganda against the Tutsis are occurring. Yeah. And there was a failure in the international community to intervene, right? And so this is what you were talking about. Super important to highlight what you were talking about these leaders that are being placed in their positions that have a desire to help other individuals who are experiencing attack on their human rights.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about, how was it specifically that the international community failed to intervene?
Yeah. I think that, I have to say that as a survivor, one of the most difficult things that I had to really deal with was the recognition that powerful countries like the US and, France and Belgium and UK and so forth, who had the means to have prevented genocide, did not do so. Because initially, I always tell people that during those 100 days of genocide, as we were being hunted, as we were being witnessing our families being murdered simply because of who they were, all of us who lived to see another day, we always said there's no way this type of crime is going to continue. Certainly somebody from outside of Rwanda, either our own government is going to come to its senses and realize the crimes that it's committing, or certainly an outside country is going to hear about it. And for me, perhaps because I was young and I was a child and I was naive, but at that time I believed that if anybody heard about it, who had the means to do something about it, that they would have done something about it. So coming to US and learning, I did a lot of research about the genocide and how it happened as an adult, to recognize that all these faxes and telephone calls had been made to the UN Security Council, which is made up of many, many powerful countries, including our own country, US, had been receiving these faxes prior to the genocide. The head of the UN peacekeeping mission, his name is Romeo Dallaire. He wrote a book called Shake Hands with the Devil. And in that book, he talks about the many cables that he sent to the UN prior to the genocide, saying that lists of Tutsis who are going to be killed are being drafted, saying that he discovered boxes of machetes that had been imported from China, not for agricultural use, but from genocide, talking about the training of Hutu youth, that he was seeing youth who were being trained to carry out the genocide. So he was giving them warnings. This was a time to intervene, but there was no intervention. As to why they didn't intervene, it certainly wasn't for the lack of warnings, and it certainly wasn't for the lack of the means to intervene. I think there was really this indifference, the same type of indifference and silence that took place during the Holocaust and other genocides that happened before the genocide against Tutsi. And it comes down to the fact, again, that we still live in a world where people feel that if a genocide is going on in a country like Rwanda, which had where they didn't have like economic ties or natural resources and things, that it's okay. And I think part of genocide prevention really is going to require this change of consciousness and shift in how we value human life. We have to come to a place where we understand that protecting human life from this crime, the greatest crime, protecting human life from genocide should be the top priority. We shouldn't be asking whether we have an economic relationship with our country, whether that country has oil, whether that country has, as long as we're still doing those type of calculations, these things are going to continue to happen. But once we realize that genocide is a threat that we should be fighting, irrespective of where it is, that leaders should be held accountable when they carry out extermination plans of their own citizens. Until we come to that place, mentally and morally, these things will continue to happen. Yeah, so part of that is really recognizing and educating people about the dangers of being silent and the dangers of indifference in the presence of this crime.
Wow, that's incredible. And I remember in a call, and I actually saved this quote from you, where you said, there is perversion when protecting natural resources is more important than protecting human lives.
Yeah.
And that's the sad truth of the matter. And to even try to wrap your head around the fact that, or it was the reason why the international community did not get involved in trying to protect Rwanda, and it was simply because there was no benefit.
Yeah.
There was no economic benefit.
There's no benefit. People could be killed. There was nothing to gain, and that kind of mindset is it's hard for me to understand.
And it's dangerous.
Honestly. And it's dangerous.
Very, very dangerous.
And we need to calculate future leaders who are going to take measures to intervene in such situations.
And it's to really raise the value and to really set the value in human life, and to say this is not negotiable. This is non-negotiable.
Yeah.
This needs to be addressed, and this needs to be resolved, and it needs to be a standard for everybody who's in the position of authority or anybody in the position of leadership.
Yes, it's in our interest. Obama, when he was in office, he created this thing called Atrocity Prevention Board, and I remember, one of the things that he said, as Americans, speaking to Americans, that we have to recognize that preventing genocide is in our national interest. Because whenever these things happen, people always say, is it in our national interest? Yes, it is. That should never be a question. When people are being targeted and dehumanized and murdered simply because of their race and their religion, we all need to speak up. Absolutely. Because that's not something that should be tolerated in this day and age. So we need to get there, mentally and morally, really, to understand that that's the only way that we can create a world free of genocide.
With your organization for the Genocide Survivors Foundation, you speak about genocide prevention, everything that we've addressed. This is your focus, one of the two focuses.
Yes.
The other focus is on helping survivors.
Yes.
And helping them with the resources and the support that they need. Can you tell us about the needs of survivors and how we can help them, and how you guys are helping them to cope and to try to thrive, and find that spark in their life again. To continue.
Yeah. So, the reason why I started Genocide Survivors Foundation a few years ago was to continue, as you said, the work that I had been doing as an individual to educate people about the crime of genocide and to try to create a world where diversity is embraced and is seen as an asset. But the second part was to help survivors. I understood that, and I still understand that I'm one of the lucky survivors in that I was able to leave Rwanda after the genocide and had an uncle who brought me here. Yes, I had my own traumas, and I still have my own traumas, but I had the opportunity to be able to go to school, to be able to go to college, to be able to go to law school, to be able to live in a place where I don't have to feel that that I'm living next door to people who killed my families. Because this is also the situation in Rwanda, is that there were so many such a large participation by the Hutu civilians that the survivors who live in Rwanda live next door to people who killed their families or people who turned them away during the genocide. So when they go to church, when they go to draw water from the nearby well, they will see people who killed their family. And even that, living in that environment, to me, is traumatizing because every day you're reminded. So I have always considered myself very fortunate in that I've had the opportunities that I've had. And I always believe that with opportunities and with privileges comes responsibility. I really believe that when we are blessed with certain things, we have responsibility to try and give back. So I also understood that because, I go to Rwanda often and I meet survivors. Some of them have progressed well and they are doing well with their families. Again, when I say doing well, all of us, we live with trauma that we're going to take to our grave. There's never going to come a place where everything's okay. Everything will never be okay. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of minimizing and being able to cope and to thrive. But there are also survivors who still lack basic necessities, who don't have proper housing, who don't have opportunities to pursue higher education. There are women who were raped during the genocide. Girls, not just women. There are girls who were raped when they were, 14, like Console, who you will be interviewing later, or even younger, who live with the consequences of the genocide. Every day they're reminded of the genocide. So there's trauma, there's economical needs, there are needs in terms of education. And I started Genocide Survivors Foundation in an effort to try and address some of those needs. So we are 501c3 nonprofit organization. So all donations that are given to Genocide Survivors Foundation are tax deductible, and we try to address survivors' needs in a comprehensive way. So I didn't want us to just focus on education or just focus on a trauma or just focus on economic needs, because again, I understood that the needs of survivors are comprehensive and they require comprehensive services. Mm-hmm. So we raise money to provide scholarships for survivors to go to universities, or those who are not able to go to universities because of, they dropped out of school because of trauma. We raise money to help them pursue vocational training or go to trade school and learn a skill that they can use to support themselves and their families. We also try to raise money to provide support for income generating activities. So there are many survivors who have many great business ideas and great income generating activities, but they need seed funding. So that's one of the things that we try to help with the trauma. I know at the conference where you and I met, we talked about the Women Survivors Retreat, which Liliane runs, and that's an effort to address some of the trauma, particularly with the women who were raped during the genocide and live with HIV and AIDS, or live with all types of consequences. Raising children who are born as a result of that rape. That's another trauma for them and for those children who also grow up and learn about the nature of their birth. So we try to provide support. Genocide Survivors Foundation provides educational support, economic support, but also social services, including mental and physical health. And we are a small organization, so I'm working very hard to try to get support. So for anybody who's listening, please visit our website. It's genocidesurvivorsfoundation.org. And I really believe, as I said when we first met, that one of the best ways that we can honor the memory of people who have been murdered in the genocide, in addition to educating people about the crime of genocide in an effort to prevent genocide, the other best way we can honor them is making sure that the widows and the orphans that they left behind are taken care of and allowed to not only keep surviving but to thrive. Because whenever I hear leaders make apologies about what happened, I'm always saying, yes, it's good to have that apology and that acknowledgement, but real apology comes when you really back that apology with services.
Exactly.
Because it's going to be 26 years since the genocide this April, but the consequences of genocide are still a daily reality for survivors. And I think that as a community, and I'm always calling on good-hearted human beings, that the best way we can honor the victims and making sure that the survivors are getting the support that they need. I personally feel like the world owes that to them, and I feel that as a survivor I have a responsibility to really advocate for them and make sure that people understand that those needs are still there, that the genocide ended, but the consequences are still a daily reality.
Absolutely.
And again, we can't eradicate the consequences, but we can at least minimize them.
Absolutely.
Through services.
Yes, and 25 years later, and these consequences are still very, very, very clearly seen.
Yeah.
And also in part, how was the country left after the genocide, right?
Yeah.
With so many experiencing trauma and just having a very difficult time picking themselves up and continuing, going back to school, working, just finding that will to live is very, very hard now. And so many people, I heard about this in the event, many people think, 25 years later there should be fine, everything should be okay,
should be good. Yeah,
but that's not the case.
That's not the case. There's been a lot of progress in Rwanda, I have to say. Rwanda is now a secure country. It's one of the biggest tourist destinations for Americans and Europeans and so forth. So there's been a lot of progress which cannot be denied, but the challenges are also there. And for me, if you truly understand what genocide is, it's not just the destruction of a people, it's the destruction of infrastructure and the destruction of relationship, the destruction of the social fabric. Because to live with the neighbors and to experience a betrayal, and then to again have to live with those neighbors, that takes a lot.
Yep.
That takes generations to repair, that type of trust. So the challenges are there. The challenges are continue to be there. But I think that certainly with enough services, that things can be even more better. And I really think that survivors have a key role to play in prevention too. So if they're able to rebuild their lives and they're able to come and be able to share their experiences like I'm sharing you now, it's gonna better help the world understand what genocide is and how it can best be prevented.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to the work, and we couldn't talk about that today, perhaps on another interview, you also have a lot of knowledge on reconciliation and also on the justice that needs to be served for those that are still at large, that were involved in the killings. Like you mentioned, your neighbors, right? And also then the approach to forgiveness, community forgiveness, so there are a lot of other dynamics we weren't able to talk about, but I'm happy that we were able to talk about the work that you're doing, the importance of accepting others and respecting the human rights and diversity and embracing that and valuing that, and the importance of valuing it, just from the lessons that we are receiving from what happens in genocide and how it begins. And so very happy that you were able to come and educate us in such a deep level. And definitely to everyone listening, when it comes to donating, if you wanted to donate to Genocide Survivors Foundation.org, I will place a link in the show notes, and please show your support to be able to provide the resources and the support that these survivors need to receive the psychological, the mental, the physical, economic support in order for them to be able to continue their lives and to thrive, just like any other human deserves to be able to do in their life. And so I'll make sure to provide that link in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for being here today. And my final question is, when it comes to your mission now in life, like what your drive and your dream moving forward, what is that for you?
Preventing genocide and supporting survivors certainly has been, it's my passion. I believe it's my reason to be. It's part of the reason that I'm here, part of the reason that I survived. As I mentioned earlier, when you survive, you say, why me? But now I know, having survived, I do have that responsibility to make sure that, to do my part in making sure that what happened to me as a child of 9 is not something that is continues to be tolerated, and to also make sure that survivors. So my hope and my dream is that through my efforts and the many efforts that are going on by individuals and organizations and institutions, is that we can create a world, my ideal world, where, again, diversity is not adversity, where we can peacefully coexist with human beings who have a different religion, who look different from us, but really where we come to recognize that as human beings we have more in common than we have differences, and that there is no human being whose life or whose value is lesser than another. That we all desire the same things, and that is to be able to live in a country or in a society, in a world where we're not discriminated against or persecuted, where we're allowed to grow and for our dreams and goals to be realized. So that is my hope, that I can contribute to bringing about such reality, and it's certainly something that I'm continuing to work on and to push for as long as I'm alive. It's not really something that I'm doing, right now and I'm going to abandon. For as long as I'm alive, I'm going to continue to call on people to be more tolerant and to be more respecting and appreciating of diversity. That is our strength, and not something that should be used to divide us.
Beautiful. That was such an honorable dream, and I look forward to seeing your journey and to seeing that progress that is being made as a society, right? Yes. To make this happen, because it's not just about the work that you're trying to do. Yes. It is about others coming together and having that happen as a united society.
Yes, and for us, one of the things, it's very easy to be overwhelmed with all the things that are going on around the world. But I always tell all my audiences the individual responsibility, that all of us feel that we have a responsibility in creating a better world.
Absolutely.
We have a responsibility to create a world that we can be proud of when we are no longer here, that we can live a better world for our children and grandchildren than the one that we found.
Yes.
I think that really having that sense of responsibility as individuals to do your part.
Exactly.
You're not being asked to solve all the problems of the world, but as long as each of us really takes on an issue in an effort to change the world, I think, like you said, it's going to take not only my efforts or your efforts, but the efforts of all of us as collectively, as individuals. So really emphasizing that individual responsibility, that we should really use our lives in a way that not only betters us as individuals or our immediate relatives, but in a way that betters the country and the world at large.
Incredible. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your story and your mission in life and the work that you're currently doing. And I am very honored to have had the opportunity to interview you and have this platform as another platform for you to share your story on.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the great work that you are doing.
Thank you.
So, God bless you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it and feel inspired and would like to be a part of the Relentless Minds community, you can join the movement for change on Instagram and Twitter. We would also love to know how your experience has been as a listener. If you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another powerful story. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.